Hello, everyone, coming from the disembodied head of Donna. Welcome this evening to our two very special guests, Jennifer Sutherland and Sara Wagner. I wanted them to read together and be able to have a conversation about their two very different books that both speak to similar issues, issues of embodiment and control, issues of domestic and civic violence, um, being a woman, especially in America, and the American fascination with the gun. Um, so we're going to start by hearing some work from each of our writers as they read from their books. Bullet Points, a lyric, which is Jennifer's book from River Books, and Lady Wingshot, which is Sarah's book from Lynx House Press. Did you guys decide who would like to read first?
We did not.
Okay, because we're going to start.
I can
just
start us out if you want.
Great. So we'll hear some work from each of our writers and then start with a few questions and have that conversation. So yes, whoever wants to begin, feel free.
I'll go ahead and start us out and then let Jennifer take over. So I'm going to just read a couple of the beginning poems from my book, Lady Wingshot, which is about the life and legacy of Annie Oakley in the Wild West show and the origins of the first myths of America, which were built on this sort of gun worship and Key Hall Wild West world. So my first poem is called Little Sure Shot. She was called both Lady Wingshot and then actually Sitting Bull named her Little Sure Shot. Little Sure Shot. She threw her birth name, Phoebe Ann Moses, like a fat rock into the creek. Never one from Moses, all that narrative bullshit, king of the enslaved. She wanted a name to move more than sea, more than stone tablets down. She chose Oakley, strip-lined near Cincinnati, Oakley, of the oak tree, like any oak tree, like one of the 500 varieties, dense and resistant to infestation of any kind. Annie Oakley, born of Moses, prophet and deliverer, lawgiver, her father laid a gun in her hand, said, shoot. Her father was a gun. Her father was a road. Her father was a dying man, was so like Moses, rock in hand. Her father was a rock in hand, was a split head, was split headed, and not Moses, but God was that light. What does it mean? She traded Phoebe from Phoebus, from Apollo, man of the sun, son of the gods, for Annie, simple measure of grace, a name, Annie Oakley, of the trees, diminutive and favored, little sharp branch poking holes in the sky. So in these first poems, I kind of wanted to establish the kind of myth making that I was trying to do in this book, because what's interesting about her multiple names is that even that last name Moses is sometimes Mosey. Like no one, even her main researchers don't really know what her real last name was or how to spell it. And so I was just drawn to that renaming of the self. She only appears on 2 census documents ever, and she made a lot of her own stories. So I kind of used her as a blank slate and set up the way that the name would work and what she represented symbolically in poems like that one. And then this one's a little bit more personal, and I think sets up the way that I'm kind of blending myself in and also gender. The way that guns are used differently was interesting to me when we think about Annie Oakley and the way that her image has been transformed. There's a poem in here about how there are Trump 2024 posters at the Annie Oakley Festival and machine guns and the things that people have done to like a girl that started out shooting to feed her family are interesting to me. And I was also thinking about fame because Annie Oakley was America's very first superstar. And so this one's called When a Girl Looks into the Water. It's the desire to make the self a character, sell pelts and turkey whistles, songs written, feet dangled over the bridge, staring down into the creek, where the sun looks like rhinestones, turns into rhinestones shaped like cactuses and wagon wheels. The sun makes me a jacket I can slip on and flip open. The shadow in lines through the trees makes me a banjo I can pick to the beat of the water bugs plopping in and out, to the sound of the mosquitoes I smack from my knee. I am not at the top of anything, so I let the wind shape my hair, blow it high as cotton candy. I am a regular vision of success in these parts, can mosey up to any bar, play any song, a murder ballad plucked long and mean. I make the gallows ropes to swing. I'm going to make something of myself. I say to the trees, to the mud of that creek, to the crawdads and snakes hissing, you can be anything. I could cut off all this hair, grow my limbs longer, be that noose they'll use to hang me when they find out what I've done to myself with style. I've done it with style, I'll say. With the stars above me, I've pulled down for these tall boots to make them shine. The way they paint the houses and fences out on the range to reflect the light, you can make everything lovelier, better, with some paint, even the grain, decorate. I have been fixing to leave since the moment I saw myself in the water, coming out of the water like a goddamn second moon, and I thought, I too can move. I can do it too. Make my bed wherever I want to rest, make even the desert soft, the mustangs and ranches and wide brimmed hats bend at my feet. I am nothing of what I was. Like God, I ignore the smaller things. I transform minnows into diamonds I pin into my ears, cattle hearts I tear with my teeth, gold capped and shining like little pinpricks of light. I can do more than you think with a song in me so loud, with a voice round and long and ready to unshape even a lit campfire. Make it a blaze I'll use to boil every body of water, purify it into something I'll drink all of, every last drop.
Hmm.
Turn it over to Jennifer.
Oh my gosh. Jennifer doesn't want to follow that. That was wonderful. Thank you. So my book also features at its core the story of a gun and violence. In 2013, I'm an attorney by day, and in 2013, I was at the Chancery Courthouse in Wilmington to try a corporate law case. Delaware is sort of the capital of corporate law in the United States. And I was there to try a case that involved the dissolution of a company that makes sex toys. I mean, there's no other way to put it. And so the case itself and all of the other lawyers, the judge, everyone else involved in this case were men. So there were all of these issues around gender that were sort of already built into this structure. And then on the morning that I was arriving to try this case, a man walked in and shot two women in front of me. And they were there in connection with a family law case. This had been a very long running family law dispute in Delaware that had gone back many, many years. There had been a kidnapping. The father of these two children had done time in federal prison and had just gotten out, and then had arranged for his father to come to court and assassinate these two women. And my book, which is called Bullet Points, is, I mean, part of it is my reckoning with this trauma and with the trauma that surrounded my marriage, as all of this was happening sort of in the foreground. I was also married to a person who was violent. And it's also, I think, reckoning with the ways that all of these structures, law and history and colonization, have sort of come together to permit all of these big and small violences that we are dealing with every day, and that so often find themselves shooting, So
The book is a book length poem. So I read sort of, I call them chunks. So I'm reading a chunk. Um, H and I drive through Wilmington in heavy traffic. The courthouse is on King Street. History and all of its contexts, woven into the seams of what we experience. Corporate lawyers like the word acquired. It sounds more neutral than the truth, which is more like taken. Purchased is sometimes like that. So is fact or evidence or property or sex. Words smoothly figure and exchange, even when the trade is made at gunpoint or by the small print no one reads. Some language is, in fact, a verbal act, like the pronouncement that declares two people spouses, as with a skirt that drapes in such a way as to hide the prize inside. The structure underneath it blocks the wearer's easy passage or escape. The New Sweden Company men built at what the Lenape people called Paxahakink, and they named the outpost Fort Christina for the Swedish queen. Now we call it Wilmington. A nation projects itself across an ocean into space, which is another country, like the past. A vacuum is a necessary fiction, as are names, as is history, as is every route to trade or fame. To put it bluntly, every so-called empty space needs filling. Many Delaware places now are named for Queen Christina, a shopping mall, a hospital, a school district. She was 12 when the ship set sail, a child. One of the women who will die inside the courthouse lobby is named Christine Belford. Queen Christina refused to marry. She renounced the throne and retired to the Vatican, where the Pope called her a woman without shame. I am alone and also not alone because I have made a second body for myself, a way of holding my experience within a fictive space. An incorporation is a body or a shield, sometimes for profit and sometimes not. After the shooting, I attempt to incorporate, to draw myself together into a new person, someone present to the world. This is a means of avoiding pain or of doubling it. A lawyer's job is to draw connections between one fact and another proposition. A lawyer looks to precedent. A poet's job is to speak connections between things not recognizable as facts, but which are true. As I walk into the courthouse lobby, I see, from the periphery, a man turn and run away. He has a large umbrella with him, the old-fashioned kind with a crook in the handle. This makes me think of the Zapruder film and the Umbrella Man. I don't think of the film at the time. I only think of it now as I'm writing, because I can infer that the man on the sidewalk saw the gun and ran. Some people think the Umbrella Man fired a shot at Kennedy, that Oswald did not work alone, that there was a gun concealed inside the umbrella shaft. Thinking of the Zapruder film puts me in mind of Matthew Zapruder, who is a poet. I read somewhere once, I think, that he is related to the Zapruder who shot the famous film. But he is not the famous poet who diagnosed my shock from what I'd written in the poem with the Wordsworth line. I've never met him, he would not know me. I reach out a tentacle for the name you see and pull it in, make it a part of me, move a little farther on. He has nothing to do with what happened or is happening, but my mind makes these connections so that it doesn't fall down into the shaft above which it is constantly, precariously, fighting to maintain its balance. Zapruder sounds like the sound of 3 shots fired in rapid succession. It is cruel for me to expose a stranger to my violent logic, but cruelty sometimes keeps the drowning mouth afloat. Zapruder is an anapest. Zapruder is a dactyl. To be honest, I am not sure how it is pronounced, where the stress or stresses fall. I pronounce the word in 3 redacted, stressed, redacted syllables, like gunshots, if that wasn't clear.
Thank you both.
Thank you.
For beautiful readings. And you set me up perfectly for the first question I'd have for you because you both illustrated what I'd like to ask you about. Both of your books um, braid personal and family history with the context of other events, other ideas from outside the self, sometimes widely buried ideas. And Sarah, I noticed that the way that you braid those ideas seems to seek to show commonalities between Annie and your own life and the life of women in America. And Jennifer, your braiding to me, which reaches broadly into law, history, fashion, film, right? Just to name a few, seems to be using those braids to illustrate the kind of dissociative nature of trauma. Could you both maybe speak a little bit about how you started to put the pieces together to make a bigger idea in your collections?
Sure. Actually, while you were speaking, Jennifer, I wrote down the line history woven into the seams, because that felt like so much what I was trying to do with my book too. That really spoke to me about the way poets kind of work through history. And for me, it was about trying to understand a closer trauma, which I've my mother has to hear me bring up her trauma every time she comes to a reading, but her mother and grandmother were murdered by her step grandfather while she was there. And this was before I was born, when she was just 14. So this was something I didn't fully understand. And I didn't understand the love of guns that I see around me. My mom was also a sharpshooter, so the kind of like disconnect between the way that people use guns and the way men use guns and the way we think about guns as Americans. My father had like 20 guns when he died. So trying to understand what the gun means, how it connects to women and trauma, kind of led me to get close to historical characters. My mom told me that she liked Annie Oakley, and that kind of led me to starting to research her. And then I felt so connected and disconnected from Annie. And so I just kind of was able to, like I said, use her as that sort of blank canvas that I could go through and talk about what was true about my family's history of gun violence, which is also true about the larger gun violence problem in America. So I hopefully that kind of answers some of it. Yeah.
So it took me years after the shooting to be able to write about it, although I kept trying. I walked away from practicing law for a couple of years, and I went and got an MFA, and I spent a couple of years at my MFA program writing about my first marriage and writing about my mother. And I kept trying to write about the shooting and could not seem to sort of get to it. And then the pandemic happened. And I think something about the pandemic, the isolation, the fact that we were all sort of very hyper focused on our bodies, how we felt, what symptoms we were having or not having. I think something about that helped me to kind of get back into my body, if that makes sense, in a way that I hadn't really before then. And I wrote this book almost in one chunk in a weekend. I sort of woke up. I had the first line and I started writing, and most of it came out in that sort of one. I mean, I went back, over years, and worked on it. And some of that work was finding the threads that had sort of planted themselves. There's an octopus. There's the references to Queen Christina. There's references to Virginia Woolf, who has a tie to the Delawares, for whom the state is named. I mean, a lot of these sort of threads were planted there a little bit, and I went back in and kind of wove them in. But I think a lot of this had just been cooking in my brain for a long time. And when it came out, these little threads were in there.
That's really interesting, because it feels like maybe you're saying like you use the research to kind of figure out how to talk about this thing that you didn't know how
Mhm.
to talk about. And for me, I started writing this right around COVID too. And I started Annie because I just did not want to talk about me, my family or me. And then
Mhm.
it came to me, it was like, you're actually talking about this. You're not talking about Annie Oakley
Mhm.
anymore.
Yeah,
Mhm.
it seems like research can do that for us
Mhm.
sometimes as writers. It can take us both out of ourselves enough where we can write, but then also lead us back
Mhm.
into the thing that we've been trying to get to all along. Um, it obviously, the gun features broadly in both of your books. You read the Jennifer, the chunk, as you call it, that mentions that, just that kind of breaking up part of the name Zapruder, and everybody associates, Zapruder with that film they've seen over and over. You also have a lot of details in there about sound details, right? About repetitive sounds. Like there's a place where you mentioned the pop, pop, pop sound of your brothers playing with caps against the curb. So there's a sounds that kind of bring us back to the gun throughout your collection. And one of my favorite lines that in Sarah's book, I can't remember which poem it is. The poem is something about like on the gun and on America and birth. And there's a line in that poem that says, America's Pitocin was always the gun.
Mm.
Right? It was the impetus for getting everything rolling was violence. So can you talk maybe just a little bit about, these are both collections that I feel I learned something from in terms of not only kind of historical context of women and the gun, but also the impact of that first person experience, because we hear about gun violence all the time in the news, but luckily, many of us have not experienced it firsthand. Um, I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about maybe what you wanted others to take away from your collections regarding issues of the gun and violence, like what illustration or what ideas can a reader take away from your books that kind of add to the conversation about this issue?
That's a tough question. Um, I think two things. I mean, one of the things that I learned very very painfully maybe is right after the shooting. I mean, literally while I was hiding in the parking lot after the shooting. I couldn't speak to my husband. I attempted to get a hold of my husband and he was not available. And what was available was Twitter. And this was back in the day when Twitter was not, the absolute hellhole that it is now. But so I was hiding behind a car and I was just frightened. And my impulse was to want to tell someone what had just happened. And so I did. I posted about it. And the reaction was immediate and in some respects supportive, but also in some respects different acts of violence. I mean, I mentioned the NRA in my tweet. And so I immediately attracted people who wanted to explain to me, too bad you were in a gun-free zone. No one could come help you. You're stupid. You have the right to remain silent. Please try it for once, was one of the things. Someone called me fat. So there is this new sort of, well, at least at that time, there was this new sort of virtual world that was developing, and it was committing, at least to me, the same kinds of violences in this virtual world as we see happen in regular life. And that was, to me, was really shocking. I think I very naively went online thinking that I would put this out there and people would be comforting or have something supportive to say, and that was not the experience that I had.
Yeah, I mean, it's surprising, but it's not, you know,
Mhm.
like people cling to their guns in this country. And I think, you know, what was kind of surprising to me was how flimsy the origins of you know, those ideologies about the gun are in America, and like what it's all built on. Like, of course, we know things about guns were brought to the country. You know, guns were kind of the thing to make America shoved into people's backs, forcing them to leave their land. You know, and then just looking at the years was shocking to me. You know, that women were given, I have a poem where I kind of listed all the years they were given the right to bear arms in 1791. And then you know, the first Americans, the indigenous Americans were given the right to bear arms in 1921. Like, it's
Mm.
crazy to me. And the way that we talk about this being like the right to rise up, and militia and all of these things, it's like, okay, but you need to think about what exactly that meant. There was only one kind of person legally allowed to own a gun back when these laws
Mhm.
were made. And also how much bullshit that whole myth is built upon. Like, thinking about Buffalo Bill, you know, William Cody, who was the kind of hero god of the Wild West show, he had a writer who was a dime store novelist who he hung out with, who just like wrote dime store novels about how
Mhm.
all these amazing things he did. He like killed all the buffalo in huge piles, and that was awesome. And he you know, was supposed to be the biggest Indian killer of the West, is what he called himself. He like carried around a scalp with him, and he scalped you know, a Native American in the Wild West show. And the guns flying everywhere, and all of this was a myth that
Mhm.
um we as a young country needed to like take to Europe and assert our power and assert our dominance. And I think it gets so twisted. People are kind of, you know, they say things about guns like, we need these for various bullshit reasons. And if you really trace the history, it's really clear, like what it started as, and
Mhm.
what it still means, basically. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
If you ask someone who, if you were in a discussion with someone about private gun ownership,
Mhm.
almost the first thing that someone will say to you in response is it's for self-defense, you know.
Yeah.
But the mythology of the gun is not based on self-defense. It is
Mhm.
very much based on conquering and killing anyone who stands in the way of conquering.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. And I mean, there are people, and that's what I kind of wrestled with too, is that for Annie Oakley, I kind of believe that that's what the gun represented to her. In her family, like I said, that's how her family didn't starve. She existed in a company of men, as a woman, a tiny little woman alone, for the most part. And her having the skills that she had, like, not only catapulted her to fame, but also probably that's the reason she survived her
Mhm.
life, you know? And Calamity Jane too. Like, there are lots of badass Wild West ladies. I'm like, that means something different for you than for the men. And it kind of goes
Mhm.
to that whole concept of the way, you know, the certain kind of people that have the rights and are yelling for the rights,
Mhm.
what they
Yeah.
want.
Well, since you just brought up that idea of the gender part, I think I'm gonna ask if you two wouldn't mind reading a couple of pieces. Jennifer, if you wouldn't mind reading the chunk that maybe starts on page 18, which deals with that issue you talked about with the case you were in, and Sarah, maybe if you would read us Whitewashing Frank Butler. I think that we can talk a little bit about those ideas of women, or that kind of gender divide, and how that impacts both of these books.
Tell me again which page you're saying.
I'm thinking the chunk starting on page, oh, I'm sorry, it's 13. My eyes are
Okay.
terrible.
Okay.
Like 13, 14-ish.
Okay.
I think that would be great.
Okay.
So,
I'm going to start a little bit back. I'm going to start on the morning of the shooting. I meet H in the hotel lobby. I have a bellboy's cart all loaded up with bankers' boxes, my exhibits, pages and pages of paper, hundreds of pages, detailing all the facts I plan to prove. Exhibits are a proxy for the truth. You look through them to what really happens. Above the throat of bitterness, a mouth erects its language like a bridge. There are some things I can explain to you and some that I cannot. Some things are found within the public record. Context, too, is a space available for occupying. My trial involves a company that makes all kinds of sex toys, dildos, vibrators, pelvises made of flesh-toned rubber, a lurid mouth glowing in the dark, tinted green. My client, my co-counsel, the other lawyers, the other parties, my bosses, and the judge, all of them are men. How'd you land this case? They ask me and guffaw. Will you be using any dramatic pause? Demonstrative exhibits. I'll stop there.
Wow. Yeah. Okay. This one's called Whitewashing Frank Butler, and there's a little epigraph explaining that Annie married Frank after besting him in a shooting match on August 23rd, 1876. And what's interesting about that, to any of you who have seen Annie Get Your Gun, they make it so that she let him win, which is not historically accurate. She actually beat him. So this is called Whitewashing Frank Butler. He is a salesman, can talk you into a bigger barrel, can weave a tale with you as Annie Oakley, sharp-eyed and light and little as she. Build him into the man you want him to be. Shadow behind that girl. How ordinary it all seems. Blue-eyed boy cutting steak across the table from a living star, orbiting. He'd shoot beside her sometimes, let her shoot things from him, the end of a cigarette. Help me name what he was at 28, bowing to 15-year-old Annie. Common? It was a common thing then, they say. We all saw our little grandmothers wither like this. Mention how she did not wither. Mention his divorce, but briefly, never names, never children, never Henrietta, whose only heritage is a timeline in Annie's story. It's widely disputed when the divorce happened. It's largely unknown her size in comparison to Annie. How tall, how wide, how dull her eyes. How old was she, and where did she bear down in a bed and birth a line of Frank stretching into now? Aren't we all bastards of something, fatherless girls and boys? And remember, it was common. Was it common? It was common. That violence, a woman left, a girl taken over.
I think that that poem particularly stood out to me because I, grew up watching Annie Get Your Gun, with my grandmother. And they make it seem like a romance, and then you realize that he was 28 and she was a child. She was 15. It is a whole different story, and the fact that, he left another family. That whole idea of gender coming into play in both of your books in a very sophisticated way really struck me. And I guess the last question I'm going to ask you, and then we're going to want to hear some more reading from you at the end, is that your books formally are completely different. Sarah's poems are traditionally lined poems, some of them longer than others. There's a few that are written more in blocks, but mostly traditionally lined poems, some in sections. And Jennifer's book is really a single long poem of with space in between every one or two sentences, kind of give some breathing room to the idea and the jumps, the juxtapositions between ideas that are there. And so, Jennifer, you already talked a little bit about how it kind of all came out in one chunk, but you obviously had to make a specific decision to kind of leave it that way. So I'm wondering if you both could talk a little bit about, as writers for these books and maybe other creative writing that you do, how do you decide when a form is best for your content?
I'm interested to hear what Jennifer. I have a friend who just naturally writes everything in prose, and then she line breaks. I write naturally very kind of short lined torrent poems, like big, long waterfalls down the page, because I write very, very fast. And for this book, well, Kristen, who's here, we both made a challenge that we were going to write 100 poems about something. And so I wrote 100 poems about Annie Oakley. They didn't all make it in here, but that kind of made me push myself into different forms. And there's a big kind of 15 part poem in the middle of this called First Myth of the Wild West, which kind of tells the whole story of the Wild West show. And that kind of was me pushing, like, you will generally write 1-page poems. You're going to write 15 pages of this poem, So I think just the sheer challenge of writing so many poems about one subject made me kind of change the way I approach each poem and try to make it different, so that I wasn't just doing the same thing over and over again. And then just, I'm naturally someone who, some of the poems, there's at least one poem in here that turned into a prose poem. And usually those longer lines and all of that come in the revision stage, when I look at a poem and say, why do you have all these dumb tiny lines? Fix it. So yeah, some of it, I mean, line breaking comes very naturally, but I always have to fix it because
I do write traditionally lined poems, but for this piece, I think I could not write this piece because I was trying to write it as a traditionally lined poem, at least initially. And I think it was when I found this form that enabled me to write it. I just sort of, once I had that, it flowed. And it's probably hard to show on the screen, but the stanzas are kind of, I guess there's sort of a hanging stanza. There's the line starts out, and then the lines that follow below are indented. And something about that shape felt right to me. It felt like taking a running leap into something, if that makes sense. And it felt like weighting the ends of the sentences. And it felt like they were little manageable little pieces. And I think that was what allowed me to kind of write into this thing that initially or previously had felt like really amorphous and difficult to assemble into something that made sense to me. And that allowed me to sort of play and move things around, which I think I needed to do. An octopus, like I said, would show up sort of all of a sudden for no discernible reason. And then it would be very easy to kind of move that earlier or later, or to bring in another stanza talking about the octopus. And I think that process, I think, was really important to me to write the book, was having the ability to manipulate it that much.
Well, and I think it's interesting in reading it, that where you moved things, where there's such an interesting like I said, the juxtapositions between the different items that you're bringing up lead to such interesting conclusions. And Sara, in your book, the way that you kind of move in and out between virtual kind of like being in the voice of Annie, and then writing about the time of Annie kind of in a third person perspective, and then bringing in the I. I think there's a lot of variety in that. We do want to hear more reading from you before we end our evening together. But I wanted to just ask you, first of all, if there's anybody in the audience that has a question, please put it in the chat and I'm happy to ask it. But I wanted to just kind of ask both of you, like, so what are you working on now? These books are books that obviously were very personal and difficult to write. So like, what's on the horizon for your writing next?
I've been trying to finalize a book I've been writing, where I'm trying to talk about architecture, especially domestic architecture, and the poetic forms, kind of the way both can be boxes for women and people who are domestically bound to the house. And then the poem too is like a male established form. And the ways that we can kind of burst out of both of these is interesting to me. So playing with form, and then more research about the home economics movement in particular, just very wild.
I am revising a manuscript that's about Alcestis, who's a character from Greek mythology. It's a very weird play, and Anne Carson has a really cool take on it. But the story is that Alcestis is married to this man who finds out that he's going to die. It turns out that he's very good friends with Apollo, so he gets to know, that he's going to die, and he doesn't want to, and he tries to find someone who will take his place. His father refuses to do it. So Alcestis steps up and says, "I will do it. I would rather that our children have a father than a mother." And so she does. And then the play takes this very strange turn where Heracles or Hercules shows up, and there's like a weird drinking scene. And Hercules goes down to Hades and brings Alcestis back. So she returns from the dead, but she's unable to speak at that point. And then the play just kind of ends. So for me, that was a way into talking about my experience of domestic violence, I think, in more detail than I did in this book. And then I am working on, this is going to sound so strange, but I am working on a book that's about insurance and Wallace Stevens. And the sort of the way that, I think it's a story about race in a lot of ways, and about whiteness, and the way that I think whiteness attempts to minimize risk. And it's called, at least tentatively, I think it's called Errors and Omissions, which I think is the most amazing title for a manuscript. So we'll see, but that's what I'm working on.
Awesome.
That is exciting. I'm going to ask Han to unmute because she had a question and I'm not sure I can convey it from what she wrote in the chat.
Hi all. Sorry if I asked something that was complicated or too big for here. I'm always interested. Excuse me, I just like dropped a paint. I am painting right now. So I'm so interested in documentary poetics and writing that's real account giving. But a lot of times when I've spoken with people, particularly on like of poetry, which is like, space where I like to like probe people about this, it's like there's such a distinction made, like, oh, well, I don't need to tell, I don't need to be specific. It's like there's like a discomfort or an unease with quote unquote telling the truth. And we're not really using the language of witness. Like I'm totally coming at it from like a nonfiction essayist, like I'm really into life writing and journalistic poetry. But there does, I don't know, it's just interesting to me that it seems somehow more acceptable to write about fiction. And for me, that brings up that there's like almost a kind of a shame in writing something that's quote unquote truthful. And we all have this kind of pilot response of like, well, what is truth? And we know what memory actually is, which is widely disparate among different people. And like, yeah, sure, all of that considered. So I was just wondering if in terms of your writing, like the tensions that come up with like giving an account and knowing it's a specific account, but that you're still doing something historical and that still matters. And what you felt like saying in response to that. Apologies for the long-windedness.
No, thank you. Yeah, I think that is interesting because I'm not someone who's very good at nonfiction. I'm actually very bad at it. So whenever I try to, just put something plainly, I always feel like I go back to this sort of rigid type of writing. So talking about myself in the realm of history is really helpful to me, to approach, and myth and folklore too, to kind of talk about something that is harder for me to just expressed plainly. Whether that's based on shame of like, is this something that should be in the world because it's um, maybe not, like you were saying, important to write about like history or Annie Oakley or something like that. So I kind of take the back door in there. But I think with this book, I had a lot of issues thinking about truth. I don't know if that's exactly kind of tied to what you were saying, because of the fact that all of these stories were made up. And I could not figure out, even her lead researchers don't know the truth about anything. So I had a lot more, I mean, they know the truth about some things, but it's hard to pinpoint exactly what her life was like. And even years, she made herself younger. So my allegiance to Annie's truth, because of things like Annie Get Your Gun and stuff too, I didn't really, I felt like I could kind of turn her into a character because she already is. But then there were certain characters that I felt that I had an allegiance to the truth. So for instance, Sitting Bull, who named her, I had a lot of concern of like, how can I tell this third person? There's like a triumvirate of the Wild West show of Buffalo Bill, Sitting Bull, and Annie Oakley. And Sitting Bull is this like political prisoner, refugee, ghost dancer, like Lakota Hunk Papa chief who's like a badass. And his story's actually a lot more interesting than Annie Oakley's story. And I kind of went down a spiral of learning and thinking like, I want to tell his story, but I want to be an allegiance to the truth. For him, I'm not going to like speak through his voice. The things that I write of him are going to be kind of direct quotes from history. And I need to record this because this is something that's left out and it is important. So I guess there's sometimes that I feel, what part of the story is important? What part of it can I be playful in? What part do I hold back, which is generally the self, unfortunately, because of shame or whatever. I don't know, but that's a roundabout answer. Yeah. Mm.
I think there's a whole stigma around the possibility of writing poetry that might be labeled as confessional.
Mhm.
Like people are terrified of being labeled as overly confessional or self-indulgent or narcissistic or navel-gazing or, all of those insulting terms. And, some of that is just misogyny.
Mhm.
Some of that is just women talking about raising children or domestic tasks or difficulty in dealing with men or loving other women or all of these things that were considered distasteful to many modernist male writers. Stevens gets a shout out there because he was all about the imaginative in poetry and this idea that anchoring what you're writing about to something that actually occurs in daily life was sort of dirtying poetry or contaminating this high art. And I love Stevens. I don't mean to sound like but I mean, that was his philosophy. So I think that's part of the issue. And we're still, untangling that. I mean, it was controversial for poets to be writing about children and having sex with their husbands in the 80s and 90s. And I don't know that we've necessarily gotten terribly better. But I do think, and I struggled with this book, with how to tell a story that had just sort of inadvertently happened into my life. I didn't know the family that was involved in this case. They had a story that I didn't necessarily feel like I wanted to speculate about. Like there was something about that felt exploitative to me. Like I should not be writing details for these real people. And there were children involved. I mean, this was a family who had children and who had just lost their mother and will have lost and has lost their father. So I wanted to respect the sort of the integrity of their lives. And the decision that I made, at least in telling that portion of the story, was to take my information from the indictment, which was public and not necessarily very poetic, but I think that suits the book. So there's the information that relays their histories, their story comes basically directly from the indictment, which I had access to. So
That's interesting that both of you seem to kind of stick to the direct source in the with the stories that you didn't feel were yours to tell. Thank you for that question, Han, and thank you for those answers. You're both so smart. And I'd love to kind of wrap this up by hearing both of you read just a little more, if you wouldn't mind.
Okay. This is from sort of the center of the book. Snuff is snuff. Witnessing means the act cannot be rendered abstract or divorced from what it signifies, establishes through the eyes a space that cannot readily be colonized. But witnessing means being in the water with the eels, and sometimes it is too difficult. I grasp for what seems solid. The man who killed Christine and her friend Beth Mulford was Thomas M. He was David M.'s father, Christine's former father-in-law. Beth came to court because Christine was afraid to appear alone. Two women, we have been taught, are less vulnerable than one. After killing Christine and Beth and wounding two courthouse guards, Thomas M. shot himself and was therefore never tried. In this way, his body figured as a proxy to the use of David M. A shareholder who cannot attend a shareholders meeting but wants to make his wishes known can do so via proxy. This delegates authority to another to cast a vote. There are many ways to insert a space between the self and what the self desires and what the self has done. Several years before the shooting, I was angry because I told John to get up out of bed, go outside and play with the children. He stood up. I'm sorry, Jay was angry because I told him to get up out of bed, go outside and play with the children. He stood up. Then he punched me in the jaw. I am told that sort of punch is called an uppercut. I don't remember what it felt like. I do remember landing on my knees and hands with my face pressed into the carpet. I remember realizing I had spun around in the air like an acrobat on a trapeze inside a tent. The lady and the fulcrum and the canvas sky above her, how light I was compared to him, compared to everything around me. When I could, I crawled into the bathroom. I tasted metal in my mouth. I locked the door. I put my face into the carpet. The bathroom rug was still damp from that morning's shower, or I cried into it and made it damp. I am not sure. When I thought that Jay was no longer standing there, I opened the door and called my brother. My brother came to the house, and the children and I left with him. I didn't know where Jay was. I didn't want to spend time packing. And then a few days later, we went home. Jay promised to be better. I tried to hold on tighter to the bar of my trapeze. A corporation is like a body. It is like a second body or a shield or a set of clothes. I know that I'm repeating myself. I do this for reassurance, to make certain that this is still me speaking. You don't have to worry about a corporation disappearing. You can always make another one or breathe money into the one you have. Scene in which the yarn is spun into a heavy cloth. I read a Department of Justice press release from 2016. David M., his mother, and his sister have been sentenced to spend their lives in prison. They claim they had no idea that Thomas M. would kill Christine or her friend Beth or anyone. It's too much again. I need to think of something else a while. Abstraction, distraction. I know, I've made it obvious. What I can't remember is the key, I think. What I think I saw but cannot see from either set of eyes. The court requires more evidence to take judicial notice of the truth. Here I rely upon my training. There are things a juror decides are true without ever having seen them. It is all too much sometimes, but then I get a cup of coffee, and it is still too much, but I'm effervescent and I sit together. Distraction is an art like everything else. I do it so it feels real. Thank you.
So beautiful. Okay. I'm gonna read let's to kind of end this out here from the end of the book that kind of deal with Annie's legacy. This is called Self-Portrait as Two Annies. Some say Annie Oakley got a fat lip hanging over the side of the horse, that the branches swelled up every bit of her. Or she was on her back with two pistols in the air. The bullet came down on her cheek and split her into two girls, one with a finger curled around a trigger, the other one saying, "Come here." Let each girl defend herself. One Annie Oakley took every free ticket given in her name, every brimming mug of beer, stole a man's pants to get money enough to buy cocaine, which she put on every window ledge, every door frame, on her face to wake it up, she said. One Annie in a jail cell, they said, mapping out which angle to shoot to get the lock and the guard and that man with his hands down his pants just watching. Every girl a gun. Even this girl, who was not actually Annie, look-alike, the papers said. Real Annie was by the sea, gentle and good as can be. She put bullets in the surf just to see what might come out. Diamondback terrapins and rays, great barrels of oil which blackened the shore, and she was still good, still clean. When Annie heard the news, she said it was the desire to purge her character that kept her from walking off into the sea at 43, disappearing. What will we do for this girl? And how much character do we put on a character? Trousers and a fraud and another woman with her exact face in a jail cell. Every woman a gun. This is called The Last Time the Lights Turned Off Over Buffalo Bill's Wild West Show. They were big, pulsing electric lights. The stage was a stadium, dirt brushed into place by borrowed and temporary labor. The livestock was pushed a final time into endless train cars, taken to places like Cincinnati and St. Louis for exhibition or slaughter. Annie retired to Ohio, back to her little hometown, tow-headed and white as the sun on a cornfield. She thought she'd run through the woods again, play at time rolling backward. Somewhere, the old standards were dead or dying. Sitting Bull reached out to her over the vast Midwest to say, "Come to me, daughter, come save me." She heard, "Come pay me," sent him a wooden box full of all her costume jewelry, including that simple golden star he'd wear on the day they raided his tent, shot him straight in the face. Annie saw space, that he'd been given space, and she laid down on the soft grass to wait for something of her own. Above her, near her on the same land stolen from the Wyandottes and Delaware in the Greenville Treaty, Ohio's own Wright brothers built and flew their first curved wooden glider, which, to Annie, looked just like a fat Canadian goose. With her exacting aim and bullet, she hit that glider right on the tail, and before her it transformed into fighter jet, bomber jet, Boeing 707, commercial airlines sprang up from the soil like soybeans, and the sky was crowded. Annie couldn't find a mark, if there ever was a mark, in those American clouds riddled with white contrails, straight and fair as every hair on her head. She said, "What have I done?" to every tree she passed on her way back to her little house in the middle of a wide field. Oh, wait,
Thank you both. Thank you both so much. This was a wonderful conversation in reading. I am very thrilled that I put you together. I think you were a great pairing. Thank you to our audience for being here. We did record this, obviously, so if you know someone who wasn't here that you think would love to hear these two very smart people speak and share their poems, please, I'll have that posted on social media a little bit later. this week. And if you haven't been to a reading with 100 Pictures of Honey before, we do have readings pretty regularly. And our next one is going to be July 14th, which is a Sunday afternoon, actually. And that's going to be Jill Curry, Ahi Lee, and Kai Kagan. We'll all be reading from their newest books. So thank you so much to Sara and to Jennifer for making the time for this evening. Thank you to our audience for being here and being such attentive listeners. And I hope that you all have a wonderful rest of the week. And I'm going to stop the recording now. And you can feel free to leave some comments in the chat, or I have to find where to do it now. There it is. Or stick around for a minute if you have another quick question you'd like to